very warm welcome to Yatrik in English. Today we have a very special guest with us, all the way from Australia. None other than our India's favorite professor, Salvatore Babones, is joining with us. Thank you, Salvatore G, for joining with us. Thank you for giving me the chance to host you again as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to be here.
Okay. So let me, before going into our interview, let me start by asking, how did you enjoy India? And this time you are there for 2 weeks, I think, 2 to 3 weeks, I
3 weeks,
think. So
almost
how did
almost
you?
3 weeks, 19 days, I think. Yeah, look, it was a great
So
trip. The highlight of the trip, as everybody knows, was the Rajdhani Express and my dinner, my fantastic dinner on the Rajdhani Express, which I hope made it all the way to the railway minister. I promised the attendant that we'd make him famous and that everyone would know that his meal was great. But I didn't know quite how true I was being. I didn't know quite how famous he would become. So, but yeah, I had a great experience of the Indian Railways. Loved Varanasi. So that was kind of the spiritual highlight of the trip was Varanasi. Got to visit the Mangalore Literature Festival very briefly, and of course the big event was the Art Festival. So I was there for 3 days at the Art Festival. Visited Banaras Hindu University. Was at the Global Investor Summit in Lucknow. So it was quite a packed trip, but one that I enjoyed immensely.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Great to know. So we request you to visit India frequently and
Yeah.
explore more about Bharat as well. So we came to know that you recently written an article on an unholy alliance versus India. So how do you define this unholy alliance? We will talk about this brief in our interview. So how do you define this unholy alliance? What is this unholy alliance actually doing to India?
The Unholy Alliance of the title of the article is an alliance between international Islamists, international Christian uh, missionary groups, and international non-government organizations. And you'll notice I've put international in front of each of those because this isn't an alliance occurring in India, it's an alliance occurring outside India. And it's an alliance of people who, for one reason or another, have their own agendas for vilifying India when it comes to international religious freedom evaluations. And they have attempted to weaponize the US Committee on International Religious Freedom and the US State Department's International Religious Freedom reports. They've tried to launder this information through the Pew Research Center and its International Religious Freedom rankings, on which India is named, I'm not exaggerating, the worst country in the world for social hostility to religion, meaning people hating others or committing violence against others for their religions. And they've gotten an outcome they want, which is for India to be vilified on the international stage. And we've seen that in the recent confirmation hearings for Joe Biden's nominated ambassador to India, where he's been asked, will you take action against this regime's repression of Muslims and the serious problems facing Muslims in India? And of course, he dutifully says, yes, I'm going to make this a top priority when I get to India. When in fact, we have fantastic quantitative data showing that within India itself, Indian Christians and Indian Muslims, almost to a person, say they are free to practice their religion. They face relatively little discrimination, and 99% say they're proud to be Indian. This is a non-problem that has been magnified by this strange bedfellows alliance. I mean, it really is strange
Okay.
bedfellows. International NGOs who tend to be atheists or at least non-religious, Christian missionaries, and Islamists working together, all because each of these three groups has its own reasons to vilify India.
Okay. So is it because of Prime Minister Modi who came to power in 2014, or this international nexus is working for a long time?
For a long time. The first Pew International Religious Freedom Report had to do with data from 2009. So well before Narendra Modi became prime minister, well before the BJP won the 2014 election, certainly long before the 2019 election. This has been an ongoing effort. On the part of each of these organizations having its own interests. So the Christian missionary groups obviously trying to pry open what they see as the Indian market for Christian conversions. Now, Christians in India, of course, can freely proselytize under Indian law. No one disputes that. The question is always, to what extent can foreign missionaries gain access to India to proselytize? And that's a more complex question. But of course, these foreign missionary groups have been very active in lobbying the U.S. State Department, first of all, to create the U.S. Committee on International Religious Freedom, and then to try to push it towards conclusions on India that would stigmatize India. The second group, the international Islamists, again, I emphasize, not Indian Muslims. These are international Islamists who've tried to weaponize these reports. So we have the irony that the database of complaints about freedom of religion in India has literally hundreds, actually probably more than 1,000 complaints of Christians not being able to worship as they please. These complaints are organized mostly by U.S. connected NGOs who literally file just huge files of complaints with the State Department. So much so that the State Department, instead of listing each of them individually, just says, and we received 250 complaints from from this organization. They don't even list them out because otherwise the report would become, so long it would be unreadable.
Oh,
However,
oh,
Indian Muslims rarely complain to the U.S. State Department about their situation in India. Now, in part, that's because there's not serious violence against Muslims in India. And in part, it's because why would an Indian Muslim go to the U.S. State Department to complain? It's just a very unlikely mechanism. So international Islamist groups have actually attempted to weaponize these reports made by Christians about their complaints, about treatment in India, complaints made to the U.S. State Department, fed through to the Pew Research Center, by pointing at them and saying, without mentioning their religion, saying, Muslims are the largest religious minority in India, and freedom of religion in India is under threat. Look at this report. So the report, which has virtually nothing in it about Muslims, instead gets used by Islamist groups as part of their evidence that freedom of religion is under threat in India. And bizarrely, the Pew Research Center, which produces these reports in recent years, its summary reports have said international religious freedom is under threat in India. Muslims are particular targets, and it gives specific examples of Muslims as targets, despite the fact that it then cites the U.S. international religious freedom data, in which over 99% of the examples given are Christian complaints. Okay, now this is bizarre enough in itself. But then, of course, international NGOs, which are, let's face it, no friends to the BJP or the Modi government, those international NGOs have now again started picking up these reports and saying, you need to help us fight human rights violations in India. Why? Well, the Pew International Religious Freedom Report names India the worst country in the world for social hostility to religion. And of course, they use Muslims as what we call in America the poster child for this repression. Again, despite the fact that the underlying evidence is overwhelmingly complaints made by Christians, and overwhelmingly complaints made by Christians about proselytization. So we have this ground level that's complaints about proselytization made to the U.S. State Department that's being laundered and laundered and laundered until the final report says India represses religious freedom of its Muslim minority, and we get the U.S. Congress talking about the repression of Muslims in India. It is truly bizarre.
okay, okay, okay. So, what do they achieve actually by giving all these kinds of reports or all these kinds of alliances which is formed over internationally? How, what do they actually do, Salvaji?
Oh, they're trying to. Each of them has their own agenda. So for international Islamists, the agenda is simply anti-India. Right? I mean, it's simply if you're an international Islamist, you feel you're in a civilizational battle between Islam and Hinduism, you take what support you can get. And those international Islamists have done similar sorts of attempts to vilify Israel, again, because they perceive themselves as being in a civilizational battle with Jews. Whether or not that's true is beside the point. Islamist organizations feel that that is the case. For the Christians, the issue is simply they want greater access to India for proselytizing. It's that simple. They're in the market for souls, and they want greater ability for international Christian missionaries to proselytize in India. So again, their motive is transparent. Why the NGOs are behind this is much more complicated. I mean, in part, NGOs by their very nature, just like a like to be anti-government. And so if there's a way they can criticize the government, they're all in on it. But also many NGOs, and in particular Human Rights Watch, have become captured by Islamists. So Human Rights Watch has great territory. They used to be mostly staffed by Anglo-American activists who had a very social justice approach to the world, but more and more Islamist Muslims. And the issue is not that Muslims have joined Human Rights Watch. It's that more and more dedicated Islamists have joined Human Rights Watch, have become members of staff there, and have really shaped the agenda in ways that people who just know the name Human Rights Watch and think of it as basically a do-gooder organization don't realize until you actually go into the reports they're writing. They are, I mean, yes, there's still criticism of China, Human Rights Watch. There's still criticism of Vietnam and Cambodia, but they've become overwhelmingly critical of Israel and India, and they downplay their criticism of Muslim majority countries. It's just become really striking. And I think that's because of a changeover in the staff members at Human Rights Watch. So the net effect of all of this is this strange bedfellows alliance, for rhetorical purposes in the magazine called Unholy Alliance, is vilifying India. And here is the kicker. Despite the fact that we have excellent, high quality survey data showing that freedom of religion in India is very strong, that there are no systematic problems. There might be individual issues. There are no systemic problems relating to freedom of religion in India. And the huge irony is the data come from the very same Pew Research Center that produces the report that says India is the worst country in the world. It's almost like Pew doesn't want to read its own research. So the survey data was a survey conducted in 2019, 2020, funded by the same Christian organization, the Sir John Templeton Foundation, the same organization that funds its international religious freedom reports. They funded a massive survey in India of freedom of religion. I suspect they funded the survey because they expected to find problems. I don't know that. I have no direct evidence of that. But they didn't find problems. In fact, what they found was that almost all Indians are very happy with freedom of religion in India. So what did they
Oh,
do? They buried the report. And so bizarrely, future international religious freedom reports from Pew don't even cite its 2019-2020 survey, which showed that freedom of religion in India was very secure. And when I say very secure, I mean we have just rock solid quantitative data. 98% of Muslims, 98% of Christians say they're free to practice their religion. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. 99% of India's Muslims say they are proud to be Indian. They're not saying I'm ashamed to be Indian because of the repression that goes on here. 99%. I mean, you could not find a statistic like that among any subgroup in Australia or the United States saying 99% of us are proud to be, fill in the blank of your country. India's Muslims are not the issue here. The issue is international Islamism, international NGOs, international Christian missionaries trying to parlay a negative view of religion in India that simply is not supported by the systematic data we have.
okay. So, well, can I ask you a question? Like, is George Soros is an extended version of the Christian missionaries?
Look, George Soros has his own priorities, and I know he's been in the news lately for his comments on India.
Mm.
And George Soros, but George Soros is not related to these Christian missionary efforts. I mean, he funds the Open Society Foundation, which funds a lot of NGOs, which do, much of it good work. They do work holding power to account. That's really important for an open society. And I don't oppose the broad agenda of the Open Society Foundation. They look, many of the organizations that receive funding from them try to do good things. And in general, even if I may disagree with the individual organizations funded by the Open Society Foundation, there's plenty of scope in society for people to do things that I happen to disagree with. That's not really a problem. The Soros problem is more one of funding levels, that someone like George Soros can really warp the agenda because people say, instead of people saying, what topic do I want to take up? They might start asking, what topic will George Soros fund? And that
Mm.
starts to undermine genuine civil society.
Okay.
And I think there's some signs of that happening in India, as elsewhere. But the Soros effect is, I think, a minor issue. It's a side note here. I mean, the Soros-funded organizations in India generally are not popular with the Indian population. So, to the extent that they
Okay.
may criticize the government, that's discounted by the fact the government can point and say, "Well, you're funded by George Soros." So
Okay.
I don't see Soros as being an issue. The broader stigmatization of India by these international religious freedom rankings is much more serious because it's brought up in the U.S.
Okay.
Congress. It's brought up to suggest that India may not be a democracy, meaning that Western countries shouldn't authorize defense exports to India. It undermines India's position at the United Nations. I mean, there are much more serious effects of these spurious international religious freedom rankings.
Okay, got it. So, but as you said, but why is George Soros having an general anti-India mindset? Because time and again he has been speaking against India as well. What kind of mindset is George Soros actually?
Look, I have no insights into the man's mind. Broadly speaking, he's an internationalist, and the current Indian government is thoroughly nationalist. That said, the main opposition party in India, the INC, has national in its middle name, and won't be out nationalismed by the BJP. So, I think every party in India, every major party, should be cautious about the Soros effect, because even if Soros may help you in opposing the current government that you also oppose, when you're in power, Soros is going to want you to become internationalist. And internationalism, for good or for bad, just doesn't fly in India. It might work in New Zealand. It doesn't fly in India. No major national politician in India could reasonably just be described as an internationalist. Even Rahul Gandhi, who clearly is an internationalist, goes to pains to emphasize that he's not, and that he's a true Indian nationalist. So, Soros was never going to like an overtly nationalistic Indian government. On top of that, though, wherever you look for vilification of India, whether it's Open Society Foundation, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Harvard University, wherever you look, you see Indians. Not necessarily Indian citizens, but you see people with Indian names, people of Indian descent. Soros, I think his chief of staff, I'm not sure the exact position, is of Indian descent. So if you ask, where is Soros getting his ideas about India? He's not spending a lot of time doing careful research into Indian democracy. He has a chief of staff who will tell him, you know, what's the situation with the Indian government. And
Okay,
I think
okay,
that that's what you'll find with all of these organizations. It's who is in their social networks who's Indian. The person in their social networks who's Indian is likely to be a Congress or Marxist intellectual. Is very unlikely. I mean, I doubt that Mohan Bhagwat knows a single person at the New York Times or the Open Society Foundation. And the people shape your perceptions, and I'm sure that's where Soros gets a lot of his perceptions.
okay. So you spoke about the Christian missionaries as well as the international Islamists as well. What is the role of media here? So we recently saw the BBC taking a documentary on 2002 Godhra incident as well. So what is the role of media as well as, see, we came to know that in US media has a very good domination and they can change the narrative in the last minute as well, and they have their debates and do such things. So what's the role of international media on keeping an eye on India as well?
Look, the BBC documentary is something really sui generis. Honestly, I think that BBC documentary was mainly about Rishi Sunak. The timing almost exactly confirms that Rishi Sunak either was about to be elected or was elected UK Prime Minister. Someone at the Foreign Office didn't like that, and that person knew that Sunak is Hindu, and is perceived as being on a similar wavelength to Narendra Modi. So that person thought, aha, I have in the file this anti-Modi report from 2002 that I can leak. It was a leak of an ancient document that was unsourced. I mean, the document itself was based on, as the former ambassador said, people we trusted in India. So it wasn't based on any actual research. It was simply a beat up job, and I think it was a beat up job much more on the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom than on the Prime Minister of India. So take it for what you will. No one's ever going to know the truth. But if this were really about Modi, it would have been leaked in 2014, 2019, or 2024. It wouldn't have been leaked in the middle of nothing time. Now when it was. More broadly, though, the top media in the U.S. and U.K., and particularly the troika of New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, have a thoroughly anti-India agenda that I can only really trace to a residual or latent or pervasive anti-Hinduism. That is to say, there seems to be a receptiveness among editors at these three organizations for stories that cast India or Hindus in a negative light. And that kind of elite anti-Hinduism is something that there's a lot of history of in the US and British elite. So if you think of Winston Churchill's derogatory comments about both Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, he was scathing about them. And when you read his comments, you kind of see some visceral hatred of Hindus, not just he didn't like these two people. It seems to be more than that. It seems to be bigotry. We'll never know. But Winston Churchill was not guarded about saying negative things about Hindus. So that kind of bigotry, that upper class bigotry, has been with us a long time. I don't think it's disappeared. It's very similar to upper class anti-Semitism. So you'll find in America and the UK, ordinary people have virtually no anti-Semitism and virtually no anti-Hinduism. Their model of both Jews and Hindus is that these are people who are successful, respectful, obey the law, contribute to society. Who do you want as your doctor? You want a Jewish or Hindu doctor, as your first preference because they have very high reputations in their fields. There's really no broad social anti-Hinduism in the US or UK. But at the elite level, particularly at the elite intellectual level, there is a romanticization of Islamism. There's a Lawrence of Arabia effect. And there is a distaste, I think, a distaste left over from Puritan Protestantism. Even though those intellectuals today tend not to be religious at all, they're inheriting that Puritan Protestant, again, visceral reaction to Hinduism as being a polytheistic religion, not reputable in the way that, say, Islam is reputable. It really is strange to me as an outsider to this world. I mean, I am an academic, so I'm on the margins of it. I see it even in my own institution, the kind of anti-Hinduism that is accepted at high levels among intellectuals in a way that if you were anti-Islam, or anti and fill in the blank of a group you don't like, that would never be accepted. But anti-Hindu is okay, in the same way that anti-Semitic is unfortunately okay in intellectual circles. Again, high intellectual circles in the Anglo-American world. So it's unfortunate, but I think that informs a lot of the naivete of the major American newspapers when it comes to negative coverage of India. When an Indian or a South Asian origin writer comes to them and says, I have this terrible story about India and how it's become a fascist country, there's a credulity among editors. Maybe they don't fact check it as much as they should, because I think it feeds into their own bigotry. Now, I don't have direct evidence of that. I want to be clear. That's my general impression from having seen these things in operation in academia, but this is not my academic research as such.
Okay, got it. So recently, Rahul Gandhi has spoken about India on a foreign soil, let's say London. So, and there has been voices against his speech as well. So, connecting all the dots, Adani issue, BBC issue, George Soros, and Rahul Gandhi. Is there any link between all these people?
No, no. There are no dots to connect. Every month, there's another dot in the recycled, Indian anti-Modiism becoming Western anti-India narrative. This recycling
Okay.
is going on every month, and there'll be a new dot next month. There's no, these are all separate incidents. They're all separate incidents that reflect the same sorts of biases. A willingness to believe something bad about India, that people are more skeptical if it has something else. Like take Adani for example. The Adani the Hindenburg report about Adani. I'm not a forensic accountant. I can't tell you how true or false it is. But the willingness to believe that there's something fishy about an Indian entrepreneur, when, for example, Bernard Arnault, the LVMH owner of LVMH in the UK, in Spain, has a very similar corporate structure, full of his family members being appointed to people. Well, when his daughter is appointed head of a brand, that's celebrated. Oh wow, she's taking over this brand. When Adani does the same, of course, it's I don't know about this, Indian family business stuff. Now, personally, I'm opposed to family business everywhere. I mean, I'm sorry, elite family business where families try to control public businesses. If families want to have a private business, I'm all for it. I'm a big fan of family business as private businesses. But when families control public corporations, I'm personally suspicious of that. But I'm just as suspicious of it in Europe as I am of it in India. And I accept, as a social scientist, this is an accepted form of business practice. It may not be my preferred form of business practice, but it's globally accepted as a way to do business, having family control of various aspects of a publicly traded family of companies. There's nothing particularly distinctive about Adani from that standpoint. It has a fairly typical structure with fairly typical levels of leverage for these sorts of family-run or family-dominated conglomerates. There's no reason to believe that it is any better or worse than similar organizations in Europe, or indeed, there are far fewer of them, but in the United States, or in the rest of the world. Now, the readiness to believe that something's wrong in India, yeah, I think that's bigotry. And that's the case
Okay.
whether it's George Soros saying something, the BBC saying something, the credulity of the news media in reporting these things, yeah, I think is reflective of some degree of bigotry at the very highest levels. But it also reflects the political divisions within India itself. That many news organizations and opinion leaders in India will leap on these stories to essentially say, well, look, someone in the West has validated what we've been saying all along. And so, unfortunately, this creates a cycle of anti-India news coverage. I'm not sure how damaging it is. I think the International Religious Freedom reports and the Rise of Democracy Institute reports, I think these are much more damaging because they have much more credibility, as opposed to the accusations made by journalists and NGOs, or even worse, hedge funds. I think rightly people discount these organizations as being self-interested in a way that the more academic organizations are supposed to be, above that kind of petty bias.
Okay, okay. One last question, Salvaji, actually. So, as you said, you are explaining all of these things, but
I'm not an expert in
I
all
have
of these
seen,
things. I'm an expert on
yeah,
certain narrow fields. No,
yeah,
no, no.
you're just so just saying this. I can see some of the minorities in other countries. Let's say the Ahmadiyas in Pakistan cannot practice Islam in Pakistan, and Shias in some countries can't practice
Yeah.
their religion in their country, and Muslims have been persecuted in China as well, and in many of the nations, as we know. But India is one such country where all kind of sects can practice Islam as well as Christianity, to an extent, any kind of religion. But why there is a common say that minorities are unsafe in India? Is that really so, Salvuji?
Look, we know, and I want to be categorical here because this is what I study. We know categorically that minority religious groups in India report having very low levels of discrimination, and they report having very high levels of religious freedom. We know that categorically. We have rock solid survey data, quantitative data on this, of people's own reporting, of their own experiences. It doesn't matter to me as a social scientist what someone tells an NGO or what someone tells a journalist, because you can always find someone who's upset. You can always find some actual injustice. I mean, has some Muslim in India faced violence on account of his or her religion? Absolutely. Just as some Hindu has, just as some Christian has. Okay, is it a systematic problem? Well, that's where we go to survey data. And when our survey data tell us that Muslims in India, and other groups for that matter in India, report much lower levels of discrimination than similar groups, for example, in the United States. So in America, 80% of African Americans report discrimination. 56% of Hispanic Americans report discrimination. 42% of Asian Americans report discrimination. In India, 24% of Muslims report discrimination. Now, 24% may sound like a lot, but you're asking people over the course of your entire life, have you ever felt you were discriminated against for being a Muslim? And fewer than a quarter of people report that that's ever happened to them. That's not much. I mean, every discrimination is bad. I don't want to dismiss it, but when we have solid quantitative data, literally asking people the same question in different countries, and we find that more than 40% of Asian Americans face discrimination, but only 24% of Indian Muslims. And by the way, 21% of Indian Hindus say they face discrimination. So it's not just Muslims. Um, that's a relatively low level. And they keep coming back to that figure. 1% of Indian Muslims don't say that they're proud to be Indian. 99%
Okay.
do. Now, I want to use that statistic in two ways. First, I want to use that to tell the world India's Muslims are proudly Indian, and they don't see a problem with being Indian. But I also want to tell Indian Hindus, because there's a very strong narrative within India of the disloyal Muslim, or of Muslims who don't sufficiently embrace their Indianness, or who are not sufficiently patriotic or proud of their country. There may be one or two Muslim intellectuals who are not patriotically Indian, but that is extremely rare. Okay, we have, again, rock solid quantitative data. The overwhelming majority of Indian Muslims are fully buy into being complete citizens of India, being highly nationalistic, highly patriotic, embrace their Indianness. And Indian Hindus should really be aware of that. I think they should, instead of seeing instead of this narrative I keep seeing popping up in India of Muslims somehow being a fifth column in India or undermining Indian unity, they should be aware that their Muslim neighbors are, statistically speaking, just as patriotic as they are. And that's something I think all Indians can be proud of.
Okay, 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 okay. Thank you so much, Saluji, for your wonderful time and wonderful interview as well. So we request you to give more and more insights of India, as we don't know the other side as well. Thank you so much, Saluji, for your time.
Always great to
Namaste.
talk to you.
Thank you so much.